he got what he wanted. That's the part nobody talks about. Edward Teller spent over a decade chasing a weapon most physicists thought was impossible, and then he built it. The hydrogen bomb. One of the most destructive weapons ever built, certainly the most powerful yet tested at the time. By any reasonable measure, the story should end there. But it didn't. After the bomb, Teller kept pushing. Bigger weapons. More yield, more power. He lobbied for weapons the military didn't ask for, in yields many critics considered strategically excessive, in delivery scenarios that made no tactical sense. So why? Not ambition. He already had the prize. Not patriotism, though he wore that word like armor. Something stranger was driving him, something that looks, from the outside, almost like compulsion. Here's what's interesting. The same quality that made Teller brilliant made him, by the end, nearly impossible to work with. The same mind that cracked one of physics' hardest problems spent the last decades of his life in a kind of siege, against colleagues, against institutions, against the idea that the work was ever finished. That pattern has a shape, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. To understand where it ends, you have to go back to where it begins. And the beginning is not Los Alamos. The beginning is Germany, 1933, and a young man who had just lost something he could never fully name. Teller was 25 when he left Germany. Not fled exactly, though the word fits. He had already seen what was coming before most people admitted it was there. The Nazis had taken power in January. By spring, Jewish professors were being dismissed from universities across the country. Teller was Jewish, and in Germany in 1933, that was not a biographical detail. It was a verdict. He was also, at that point, already marked as someone exceptional. A student of Werner Heisenberg, a young physicist whose instincts ran toward the large, the theoretical, the ambitious. He left Germany in 1933, spending time in Copenhagen and in Britain before moving to the United States. Then Los Alamos, New Mexico, in 1943, when Robert Oppenheimer recruited him for the Manhattan Project. But here's the detail that matters. Teller didn't want to work on the Manhattan Project. Or rather, he wanted to work on something else. He had a different bomb in mind. As early as the early 1940s, Enrico Fermi had raised a question over lunch. One of those offhand, speculative questions that physicists float without expecting them to go anywhere. What if a fission bomb could be used as a trigger for a much larger fusion reaction? What if you could use hydrogen isotopes and achieve yields that dwarfed anything a fission device could produce? The conversation was brief. Fermi moved on. Teller didn't. Soon after, he began calculating. And the calculations at first looked promising, which is often how the worst fixations begin. This is the first thing you need to understand about Teller. He fell in love with problems, the way some people fall in love with people, completely, with poor judgment about timing, and with a tendency to reorganize his whole life around the object of that love. The super, as he called it, the hydrogen bomb, became that object. From the moment Fermi's question landed, Teller was, in some deep sense, already gone. At Los Alamos, Teller was supposed to be working on the fission bomb, the implosion problem, the engineering, the calculations that Oppenheimer needed from everyone on his team. He did some of that work. But most of his energy went somewhere else. He was running calculations on the super in the margins, in his spare hours, in his head, during meetings about other things. He kept bringing it up. He kept nudging Oppenheimer toward it, arguing that the lab should pivot at least some of its resources, that the hydrogen bomb deserved serious attention. Oppenheimer said no, politely at first. Then, less politely, the relationship between Teller and Oppenheimer is one of the defining personal dramas of 20th century science, and it's tempting to reduce it to a simple rivalry. But that's not quite right. What it actually was is stranger and sadder. Oppenheimer respected Teller's mind. He had recruited him for one reason. Teller was among the handful of minds that could hold the full theoretical weight of what they were doing. He needed him. But Teller kept refusing to do what he was needed for. He kept pointing elsewhere. And in a project where everyone's effort was tightly coupled, where one person's distraction could cascade into delays across dozens of interconnected problems, that refusal had consequences. Hans Bethe, who led the theoretical division, later recalled, in essence, that Teller made real contributions, but that extracting them was harder than with anyone else on the team. What he meant, underneath the courtesy, was this: Teller was already somewhere else. He was already on the bomb that didn't exist yet, already calculating yields for a weapon that most of his colleagues thought was a fantasy. And here's the part that should make you pause. He wasn't entirely wrong. The super was not a fantasy. It was a genuine theoretical possibility. But it was also, in 1943, genuinely unsolved. The math kept running into problems. The physics kept generating objections. Every time Teller thought he had a design that worked, the next layer of calculation revealed something that didn't. He would fix it, or he'd find a workaround. Or he'd reframe the problem so the objection no longer applied. This is what obsession looks like from the inside. It feels like rigor. It feels like diligence. It feels like refusing to give up when everyone else has gotten comfortable with easy answers. But obsession also has a cost. And for Teller, the cost started accumulating in ways he didn't see, or couldn't afford to see. Because seeing it would have required admitting that the object of his focus wasn't worth the price. By the end of the war, he had strained relationships with many colleagues at Los Alamos. Not dramatically. There were no screaming arguments, no public confrontations, just a slow accumulation of friction, a reputation for being difficult, a sense among the people who worked with him that Teller's loyalty was always conditional on whether you were as excited about the super as he was. When Trinity went off in July 1945, when the fission bomb worked, when Oppenheimer's project succeeded, most of the physicists at Los Alamos felt something complex and unresolvable: awe, horror. The specific weight of having done something that couldn't be undone. Teller felt those things too, but he also felt something else, a sharpened urgency. Because if the fission bomb worked, if they had actually done it, then the super was next. It had to be. The logic was obvious to him. The question he asked himself that night, according to people who knew him, was not whether to build the hydrogen bomb. It was when and how fast. The post-war years were the first real test of what Teller's obsession would cost him. Most of the physicists who had worked on the Manhattan Project went home. Back to universities, back to research, back to the kind of science that didn't have a body count. Some of them became vocal opponents of nuclear weapons. Some became policy advocates, trying to get ahead of what they had helped create. Teller went back to Chicago, then to Los Alamos as a visitor, then eventually to the University of Chicago. He continued his calculations on the super. He lobbied anyone who would listen: military officials, government administrators, fellow physicists, for a crash program to develop the hydrogen bomb. For 4 years, almost no one listened. This is where the psychology starts to get complicated. Because Teller, during those years, experienced something that people with his particular disposition handle very badly, he was right, and he was being ignored. He wasn't subtle about it. He wrote memos. He sought meetings. He pressed his case with anyone in the defense apparatus who would take a call from a physicist. The response, again and again, was polite disinterest, or, worse, the specific condescension of people who believed the fission bomb had already settled the question of American nuclear superiority. Why build a bigger weapon when the weapon you had could already flatten a city? Teller's answer was always the same, because the Soviets will. He was right. But being right in advance, before the evidence arrives, is one of the most isolating experiences a person can have. Especially when the people ignoring you are not stupid, just operating on different assumptions. And the longer Teller was right while being ignored, the more certain he became that the only reliable tool he had was persistence. Push harder. Stay louder. Never let the subject drop. This is the period that most biographies gloss over, because nothing dramatic happened. There was no confrontation, no crisis. Just a physicist, not yet 40, spending years writing arguments that nobody wanted to read and making cases in rooms where nobody was convinced. What it produced, quietly, without Teller noticing, was a kind of radicalization, not of his politics exactly, but of his method. He learned that the only thing that moved institutions was pressure, and that pressure required treating opposition not as a legitimate disagreement to be engaged, but as an obstacle to be overcome. That framing was adaptive during those years. It helped him survive the frustration. But framings, once learned, are hard to unlearn, and the habits of thought that get you through a period of marginalization become a problem when you're no longer marginal. When you have power, when the institutions are listening, when the people you're now overriding are no longer adversaries but colleagues. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in August 1949. It was faster than many in the American defense establishment had predicted. The shock of it, the sudden collapse of the assumption that the U.S. had years of nuclear monopoly ahead of it, created exactly the political opening Teller had been waiting for. Within months, President Truman authorized the crash program. The hydrogen bomb would be developed. The super would get its resources, its personnel, its institutional backing. Teller had won. But winning, it turned out, was more complicated than he had imagined. The crash program didn't go the way Teller expected, because the problem that had been bothering the super's design for years hadn't gone away. Every calculation still ran into the same wall. The physics of igniting and sustaining a fusion reaction in a deliverable weapon didn't quite work out. The numbers were off. The yields were wrong. Other physicists were now working on it. People like Stanislaw Ulam, a mathematician of extraordinary ingenuity who had been at Los Alamos since the war years. And Ulam started finding problems that Teller hadn't accounted for, problems that suggested Teller's basic design approach was flawed. The relationship between Teller and Ulam became one of the stranger collaborative tensions in the history of science. They were both brilliant. They both wanted the bomb to work. But they were operating on the problem from completely different angles. Ulam from mathematical skepticism, Teller from the conviction that it had to be possible and therefore must be solvable. In early 1951, Ulam came to Teller with an idea, a different configuration, a two-stage approach in which a fission primary would compress a thermonuclear secondary before ignition. Teller's contribution was the specific mechanism, using radiation, specifically X-rays from the primary explosion, to drive that compression. Together, this became the key to making the hydrogen bomb work. What happened next is one of the most contested moments in the history of physics. Teller claimed the insight was his own, or at least jointly arrived at. Ulam said, consistently and carefully, that the key idea originated with him. Other physicists who examined the documentary record later generally sided with Ulam. That dispute never resolved. And the fact that it never resolved mattered, because the credit question wasn't just about who deserved recognition. It was about what kind of person Teller was. If he had taken Ulam's idea and claimed it, that was one thing. If the ideas genuinely emerged together, in the way that happens sometimes in intense collaboration, that was something else. The ambiguity left a permanent shadow over Teller's most important achievement, the one that was supposed to vindicate everything. The shadow was particularly uncomfortable because it arrived at the moment of greatest triumph. The bomb worked. That was real. But the story of how it worked was contested, and the contestation was not minor. It went to the heart of the central justification Teller had offered for everything he had sacrificed. He had been difficult to work with, distant from the community, obsessive about his own path. The implicit bargain was that genius could justify all of that, and the question Ulam's account kept reopening was, whose genius exactly? Teller never answered it to anyone's satisfaction, including some who knew him suspected his own. But here's what matters more than the credit dispute. When the Teller-Ulam design, as it came to be officially called, was tested in November 1952, it worked as a proof of concept. Ivy Mike was not a deliverable bomb. It was a building-sized experimental device. Ivy Mike, about 10 megatons, about 700 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The super existed, and Edward Teller, who had spent a decade refusing to stop thinking about it, who had sacrificed collegial relationships and professional goodwill and the esteem of most of the people who had worked alongside him. Edward Teller had his bomb. So what did he do next? He testified against Robert Oppenheimer. In 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission held security hearings to determine whether Oppenheimer's security clearance should be revoked. The case against Oppenheimer was thin, a collection of old associations, pre-war left-wing connections, a pattern of opposition to the hydrogen bomb program that his enemies characterized as obstruction and his defenders characterized as legitimate scientific judgment. Most physicists who testified at the hearing supported Oppenheimer. They spoke to his character, his loyalty, his record. Teller testified differently. He didn't accuse Oppenheimer of disloyalty directly. He was too careful for that. But he said, on the record, that he would prefer to see the vital interests of this country in hands which I understand better and therefore trust more. It was enough. Oppenheimer's clearance was revoked. His career in government science was effectively ended. Many in the physics community reacted sharply. Not loudly, not always publicly, but in the way that actually matters in a small professional world. He was cut off. Colleagues stopped speaking to him at conferences. Invitations to certain institutions dried up. The tacit solidarity of the scientific community, which had included him despite his difficult years at Los Alamos, contracted around him like a closing door. He had expected criticism, but not this. Not the completeness of it. For the rest of his life, Teller would insist that his testimony had been honest, that he had said nothing false, that his obligation to the country outweighed his obligation to any individual. He never fully recanted. He never quite apologized, but there are accounts from people who knew him well in later years, who saw him after conferences where former colleagues had looked through him rather than at him, of a man who carried something unresolved. Not guilt exactly, something more like a wound that had never been properly treated. The exact shape of what he carried, nobody could say for certain. The wound showed up in odd ways. He would sometimes raise the subject of the testimony unprompted, not to defend it again, but in a way that suggested the defense wasn't entirely settled even for him. He was a man who had made a calculation and couldn't fully stop recalculating it even decades later. Whether the recalculation ever produced a different answer, no one who knew him could say with confidence. But the fact that he kept running it is itself a kind of answer. Here's the thing about Teller's testimony. It wasn't simply political or purely careerist or even straightforwardly ideological. Those explanations are available, and they're not wrong exactly. But they're not complete. To understand it, you have to go back to what Teller actually believed. He believed, with a sincerity that is difficult to dismiss, that the Soviet Union represented an existential threat. Not a manageable adversary, an existential one. The kind of threat that required, at minimum, the most powerful deterrent physically achievable. And Oppenheimer, who had used his scientific prestige and government influence to delay and complicate the hydrogen bomb program, had, in Teller's framework, been an obstacle to survival. That's not a cynical reading. That's actually what Teller thought. But here's the trap in that kind of thinking. When your cause is large enough, when the stakes you've assigned to it are existential, then the people who oppose you aren't just wrong. They're dangerous. And dangerous people can be treated differently than people who are merely mistaken. Teller's testimony against Oppenheimer wasn't malice. It was the logical conclusion of a worldview in which the super was not just a weapon but a necessity, and in which anyone who had stood in its way was, by definition, a threat to the necessity. The problem is that worldview had no internal check. If you believe your cause is existentially important, then every obstacle to it is also existentially important to remove. And every sacrifice required to remove it is, by the same logic, justified. That kind of reasoning doesn't stop. It just keeps finding new obstacles. After the Oppenheimer hearings, Teller's relationship with mainstream academic physics was, for practical purposes, over. He was not exiled. He retained his position, his funding, his access to classified programs. But the warmth was gone. The sense of belonging to a community of people who, however much they disagreed, were basically on the same side. He responded by building a different community, one where nobody would ask the question he'd stopped being able to hear. In 1952, even before the hearings, he had been a driving force behind establishing a second nuclear weapons laboratory, co-founded with Ernest O. Lawrence, that began operations in September 1952 and would become Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. His argument for it was partly technical. Competition between labs would accelerate innovation. But the subtext was personal. He wanted a place where his approach to weapons development, aggressive, expansive, oriented toward higher and higher yields and broader strategic applications, would not be questioned by people who thought the hydrogen bomb was already too much. At Livermore, Teller found something he hadn't had since the early, excited years of theoretical physics, an institution that shared his urgency. Scientists who didn't look at him sideways when he proposed another order of magnitude of yield. A culture organized around the assumption that more was better, that the only answer to an adversary's capability was a larger capability, that the work was never finished because the threat was never finished. He thrived there. And that thriving is one of the more unsettling parts of this story. Because the question it raises is, what happens when someone with Teller's psychology finds an environment perfectly calibrated to reinforce it? The answer, at Livermore, was a productive one, in the narrow sense that weapons got built and technical problems got solved. But it was also an environment that insulated Teller from the friction that might, in another context, have slowed him down or introduced doubt. The people who might have pushed back on his strategic assumptions, the arms control advocates, the physicists who thought the arsenal was already sufficient, weren't in the room. Or they were in the room and didn't stay long. What remained was a community of people who had, largely, already decided that Teller's framework was correct and who built their careers on the premise that the work he had pointed toward was the most important work there was. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, Teller was one of the most forceful advocates for nuclear weapons in the American defense establishment. He pushed for massive yield warheads. He pushed against early arms control negotiations, arguing that any treaty that constrained American testing would freeze the U.S. at a disadvantage. He was deeply skeptical of any framework that relied on Soviet compliance. Some of his concerns were legitimate. Some of his technical arguments were correct. The history of arms control negotiations is complicated enough that reasonable people can disagree about how much weight to give his skepticism. But there's a pattern worth noticing. Every time a political or technical development seemed to suggest that the arms race might slow down, Teller found a reason it wouldn't. Or shouldn't. Every time an arms control measure came close to passing, he found technical objections. Every time a test ban was proposed, he argued that the U.S. couldn't verify Soviet compliance, that the moment of apparent stability was actually the most dangerous moment. He was sometimes right about specific objections. The verification problem was real. Soviet intentions were genuinely opaque. These weren't invented concerns. But the pattern, the consistent tendency to find in every situation a reason to keep going, is harder to explain purely on technical grounds. What it looks like from the outside is someone who had organized his entire identity around a project and who couldn't tolerate the project ending. Because if the project ended, if the arms race stopped, if the hydrogen bomb was sufficient, if the threat was contained, then what had everything been for? That's not a question Teller could afford to answer. In 1983, Ronald Reagan gave a speech that surprised nearly everyone in the national security establishment, including many in the defense community who advised him. He proposed a research program aimed at developing a missile defense system, a technological shield placed in space or in the upper atmosphere capable of intercepting Soviet nuclear missiles before they reached American soil. The idea was not new. Missile defense concepts had been floating around since the early days of the nuclear age. They had been largely rejected by physicists, by defense analysts, by arms control theorists, on the grounds that the offense-defense dynamic was asymmetric. It was far cheaper and easier to add missiles than to add interceptors, making any defensive shield ultimately penetrable. Reagan's version of the idea had a name, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Critics called it Star Wars. Teller had been pushing the concept for years. Not publicly, at first. Through back channels, through access to Reagan's inner circle that his association with conservative policy networks had given him, he had met with the president. He had argued, with characteristic intensity, that directed energy weapons, lasers, particle beams, technologies that were mostly theoretical at the time, could, if properly funded and developed, provide a workable missile shield. He believed it. That's important. He wasn't selling a fantasy he knew was hollow. But he was also, at 75 years old, doing something recognizable, finding the next necessary thing. The super was done. The hydrogen bomb existed. The arms race had achieved, in some technical sense, a kind of saturation. Both superpowers had more than enough to destroy civilization several times over. So now the necessary thing was defense. Now, the necessary thing was a shield. The physics community's response was almost exactly what it had been to Teller throughout his career: skeptical, increasingly hostile, convinced that the technical barriers were far larger than he was admitting. The physicists who examined Star Wars most carefully concluded that the directed energy weapons Teller was championing were a decade or more away from being deployable, if they were achievable at all. That the testing data from relevant experiments was far less promising than Teller had represented to the president and his advisors. Some participants and critics later argued that the program's results had been significantly overstated in the briefings given to Reagan administration officials. Teller disputed this. He always disputed it. The dispute mattered because it touched something fundamental. What are scientists obligated to say to the people who fund them? The stricter view that you communicate what the data actually shows and mark uncertainty honestly was the position of most of his critics. Teller operated on a different principle, that the program's potential justified describing it in terms of what it could be, if everything went right, if funding was sufficient, if the remaining engineering problems were solved. That kind of advocacy is not unusual in science policy. But it has a cost, which is that the people making decisions on the basis of those descriptions may not realize how much load-bearing work the words if and could are doing. But the pattern was, by now, familiar to anyone who had watched his career. A technological possibility, real but uncertain, inflated to a certainty for the purposes of mobilizing political will. He had done it before. With the super, it had worked. The bomb had existed and had worked, and the inflation of possibility into certainty had turned out to be retroactively justified. This time, it didn't work the same way. Star Wars absorbed billions of dollars and did not deliver the space-based shield its advocates had envisioned. And here's the part that cuts deepest. Teller was old enough to know the difference between what SDI was and what he was claiming it was. He wasn't naive. He understood the engineering gaps. What he believed, genuinely it seems, was that the claiming mattered more than the gap, that mobilizing will toward a goal was itself a form of making the goal real. That the difference between this is possible someday and this is possible now was a detail that could be corrected later, once the political infrastructure was in place. It's the same logic he had used his whole career, and it had worked often enough that he had no reason to stop. There is a version of Edward Teller's life that is a simple morality story, the man who weaponized physics and then spent his career weaponizing science policy, leaving a trail of broken relationships and inflated claims and a world measurably less stable than the one he entered. Here's what the simple version leaves out. That version isn't wrong, but it's not complete, because Teller also came from somewhere, and where he came from matters. He was born in Budapest in 1908, into a Jewish family in a city that, within a decade, would experience revolution, counter-revolution, and the specific virulence of Central European anti-Semitism in the interwar years. He watched colleagues dismissed from their positions in Germany. He left a continent that was, within a decade of his departure, industrializing murder. He arrived in America with a belief about the world that was not paranoid. It was, in fact, historically grounded, that the distinction between a society capable of atrocities and a society that hadn't committed them yet was a matter of power and deterrence, not fundamental moral difference. That the cost of being naive about threats was not embarrassment, it was Auschwitz. That belief shaped everything. His urgency, his willingness to trade relationships for capability. his inability to believe that stability, once achieved, would hold. He had seen stability disappear before. He knew what came after. The tragedy is not that he was wrong about the nature of the threat. It's that the tools he reached for, bigger bombs, more yield, technological dominance, were designed for a world that operated on the logic of the 1930s and 1940s, and the world he was actually living in kept being more complicated than that. He never quite updated the model, and the model, by not updating, became self-sealing. Every new threat confirmed the original premise. Every adversary became a version of the one he had fled. Every arms control advocate became a version of the European intellectuals who had looked away in 1933. Well-meaning, dangerous in their complacency, too comfortable to see what was plainly visible to anyone who had paid the full price for naivety. You can understand why the model felt airtight. From the inside it was. Every piece of evidence that might have complicated it had already been assigned a place. Either the threat was obvious, or the person failing to see it was dangerously mistaken. There was no third category. What the model couldn't process was the possibility that the threat was real and the response was still disproportionate. That you could be right about the danger and wrong about the remedy. That the same clarity of perception that lets you see a threat early can, if left unchecked, become the thing that prevents you from seeing when the threat has changed shape or scale, or when a different kind of response has become available. Precision of focus in one direction tends to produce blind spots in others. That's not a flaw unique to Teller. It's a feature of a certain kind of highly organized mind, the kind that achieves things others cannot and pays a price for it that isn't always visible until much later. By the late 1980s, Teller was in his 80s, still writing, still appearing at conferences, still making the case for missile defense, still finding reasons that the project was unfinished. He had lived long enough to see the Cold War end. Not through the kind of military confrontation he had spent his career preparing for, but through something stranger and more diffuse: economic pressure, political collapse, the internal contradictions of a system that couldn't sustain itself. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The threat that had organized Teller's entire adult life, the threat he had used to justify everything, ceased to exist in its original form. He was 83. His response, characteristically, was not to reconsider. It was to find the next threat. He wrote about nuclear proliferation, the risk that the weapons technologies of the superpowers would diffuse to smaller states, to non-state actors, to the kind of adversaries that a strategic deterrent could not deter, because they had no territory to lose. This concern was not paranoia, it was prescient. The proliferation problem is one of the defining security challenges of the 21st century, and Teller saw its outlines clearly. But the solution he proposed was, again, the same solution he had always proposed: more capability. Better defenses. The continued primacy of American technological power. He could not imagine a world organized on different principles. Not because he lacked imagination. He was one of the most imaginative minds of his century. But because his imagination had been shaped, from the beginning, around a specific set of stakes. And those stakes had been so vividly, so traumatically real, that updating them felt, at some level, like a kind of betrayal. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in July 2003. He was 95 years old. He died less than 2 months later. At his memorial, people said the expected things: that he was brilliant, that he was complicated, that he had served his country, that history would require some time to sort out the ledger. Some colleagues who had avoided him for decades were mostly dead themselves by then. The community that had closed around him after the Oppenheimer hearing had dispersed into time. What remained was the record. The hydrogen bomb. The Teller and Ulam design. The physics that still underlies every thermonuclear warhead on Earth. That's real. That's his. The network of relationships destroyed or damaged along the way. Oppenheimer's career. The decades of professional exile. The specific bitterness of colleagues who had once been friends. That's real too. And then there's the larger question, the one that his life poses without quite answering. What do you do with a person who was right about the most important things and wrong about the consequences? He was right that the Soviets would build a bomb. They did. He was right that thermonuclear weapons were physically achievable. They were. He was right that the Cold War required a credible deterrent. It did. But he was also wrong that bigger was always better. Wrong that arms control was always a trap. Wrong, arguably, that the Oppenheimer hearing was a necessary sacrifice. And wrong, almost certainly, that the right response to every threat is an escalation of the same kind of power that created the threat. Those wrongs have costs too. They're just harder to count. The hardest thing to count is what didn't happen. Which voices weren't in the room? Which arguments weren't made because the person who might have made them had been discredited or driven out, or had simply decided that the fight wasn't worth it? The counterfactuals of scientific history are genuinely unknowable. But the structure of how decisions get made, who is trusted, who is excluded, who has standing to speak, that structure has consequences that compound over time. Teller didn't just build a bomb. He helped shape who got to have opinions about what happened next. And the record of what those opinions produced is long and mixed and not finished. Here's the version of this story that's easiest to tell, and therefore the version most likely to be wrong. Teller was a monster. Or, Teller was a hero. Or, the bomb was evil, and so was everyone who built it. Each of those framings is comfortable because it closes the question. It lets you put Teller somewhere and move on. But Teller's life doesn't close. It stays open. Because what Teller actually represents is something more troubling than a villain or a hero. He represents what happens when a genuine insight, the insight that the world is dangerous, that threats are real, that naive optimism can be fatal, hardens into a fixed lens through which every subsequent fact is filtered. The insight wasn't wrong. The world was dangerous. The Soviet Union did represent a real threat. The physics of thermonuclear weapons was worth understanding. But the lens, once fixed, couldn't accommodate complexity. It couldn't accommodate the possibility that the moment required something other than more power. It couldn't accommodate the idea that a colleague's opposition might be principled rather than treasonous. It couldn't accommodate, ultimately, the simple human fact that the people around him were people, complicated, fallible, operating from their own frameworks, and not obstacles to be cleared or resources to be deployed. That's what obsession does, in the end. It doesn't destroy the mind, it focuses it. And focus, taken far enough, becomes a kind of blindness. Go back to the beginning. Go back to Germany, 1933. A young physicist who understood that the world was not stable, that stability was something you had to build and fight for and be willing to pay for. He wasn't wrong, but somewhere between that departure and the Nevada test site and the security hearing room and the Oval Office briefings and the 80 years of accumulating conviction, somewhere in there, the thing he was fighting for became inseparable from the fighting itself. The threat justified the weapon. The weapon justified the sacrifice. The sacrifice justified the testimony. The testimony justified the isolation. The isolation justified the next project, and the next, and the next. Each step followed from the last. The logic was internally consistent, and that's the part that should stop you, because this isn't a story about a bad man who did bad things. Those stories are simpler. Those stories have clearer places to rest your judgment. This is a story about a mind that organized itself around a real danger and then couldn't stop organizing. About a person who learned, very early, that the cost of being wrong about a threat was everything, and who spent the rest of his life making sure he would never be wrong in that direction again. Even if it meant being wrong in another direction entirely. Even if it meant the friendships. Even if it meant Oppenheimer. Even if it meant pushing for weapons that had no tactical purpose, for a shield that physics couldn't yet support, for a world ordered entirely around the proposition that power was the only thing that lasted. He got what he wanted. That's the part nobody talks about. And getting what he wanted wasn't enough, and couldn't be enough, because the wanting had become the thing. The wanting had become the shape of his mind, the structure around which everything else organized. He built the bomb. He built the next bomb. He tried to build the shield. And somewhere in there, the man who had left Germany with the knowledge that the world was dangerous forgot that the danger he was protecting against could also come from inside the thing you were building. That's the cost nobody counted. That's the part that stayed open.